The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and it was my daughter-in-law's voice on the other end, bright and warm the way it always was when she wanted something. "We thought it would be lovely to have Christmas at the lake house this year," Sandra said. "The kids haven't seen it in so long. And you shouldn't be spending the holidays alone up there, Walter." I told her that sounded fine. I told her I'd start getting the place ready. What I didn't tell her was that I had already spoken to my lawyer 3 days earlier, and that the conversation had changed everything. But let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Walter Kowalski, and I turned 68 last September. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Winnipeg, designing drainage systems and bridge supports, and the kinds of unglamorous infrastructure that keeps a city from falling into itself. I retired at 62, took a modest pension, and moved full-time to the lake house on the eastern shore of Lac du Bonnet that my wife, Marguerite, and I had owned since 1994. We had bought it when our son, Philip, was 11, and our daughter, Claire, was 8. We had painted every room ourselves. We had replaced the dock 3 times. We had buried our old retriever, Pepper, under the Manitoba maple at the edge of the property in 2007, and Marguerite had cried harder than either of the children. Marguerite died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in March and gone by October. 7 months from the first scan to the last breath, and I was with her for every one of them. I held her hand in that hospital room in Winnipeg, and I talked to her about the lake house, about the way the light looked on the water in early morning, about the loons we could hear from the bedroom window in summer. I told her I would keep the place exactly as she loved it. I meant it completely. After she was gone, I did keep the house. I spent my winters in Winnipeg, in the apartment I rented near the university, and my springs and summers and falls at the lake. I was not a lonely man. Exactly. I had 2 or 3 friends from my working years who called regularly. I had Claire, who lived in Calgary with her husband and their 2 daughters, and who phoned every Sunday without fail. And I had Philip. Philip was 41. He lived in Winnipeg with Sandra and their 3 boys. And for the first year after Marguerite died, he came to the lake house often. He brought the grandchildren. He helped me install a new water heater and reshingle a section of the roof that had lifted in a spring storm. He sat with me on the dock in the evenings, and we talked about his mother and about his boys and about the accounting firm he had started with 2 partners 6 years earlier. That firm was where the trouble had begun, though I wouldn't understand that until much later. Sometime in the 2nd year after Marguerite's passing, the visits became less frequent. Philip called less. When I did see him, there was a new quality to the way he looked at me, something measuring and careful behind his eyes that I couldn't quite name. I told myself he was busy. The firm was growing. The boys had hockey and school activities. Sandra was involved in several community boards. People got busy. I understood. The lake house was worth something now. Property values on Lac du Bonnet had climbed steadily throughout the 2010s and had accelerated sharply after 2020. The house and the 3/4-acre lot were assessed at just under $900,000. I also had a registered retirement income fund of roughly $400,000, a small defined benefit pension, and the proceeds from Marguerite's life insurance policy, which I had invested conservatively, and which had grown to about $220,000. I was not a wealthy man by any stretch, but I was comfortable. I owned things free and clear. I had no debt. I mention this only because it seems to be the thing that mattered most to certain people. In October, about 2 months before that phone call from Sandra, I had a routine appointment with my family doctor in Winnipeg, a checkup before the winter. My blood pressure was excellent. My cholesterol was within normal range. The only notable thing was a slight irregularity in a liver enzyme that my doctor wanted to watch. He told me it was almost certainly nothing, possibly a supplement I was taking, but that he wanted to retest in 3 months. I didn't think much of it, but I made the mistake of mentioning it to Philip when he came by the apartment the following week for dinner. He asked about it with what seemed like genuine concern, and I told him what the doctor had said, that it was likely nothing, that we were monitoring it. He nodded. He asked a few more questions. He said he was glad I was taking care of myself. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm I had never heard of, requesting documentation related to the estate of Marguerite Kowalski-Tran. The letter cited my name as the sole executor and asked me to contact the office at my earliest convenience to discuss the status of various assets. It was written in the dense, formal language of legal correspondence, and at first I assumed it was some routine administrative matter I had overlooked. I called the number on the letterhead. The lawyer who answered was a woman named Deborah Haynes. She seemed surprised to hear from me, and even more surprised when I explained that I had no idea why her firm had contacted me. There was a long pause on her end. Then she said, carefully, that she had been retained by a third party to conduct a preliminary inquiry, and that she was not at liberty to disclose who had initiated the inquiry without further instruction. I asked her directly, was my son Philip involved in this? Another pause. She said she could not comment on that. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the Winnipeg apartment for a long time, looking out the window at the November street, and I thought about the way Philip had looked at me over dinner, the measuring quality in his eyes, the questions about my health. The following morning, I called my own lawyer, a man named Raymond Osei, who had handled our affairs for 15 years, who had written our wills and managed the title transfer on the lake house, and who I trusted absolutely. I told him about the letter. I told him about the conversation with Philip. I told him about the liver enzyme result and what Philip had asked me. Raymond listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Walter, I need you to come in. Today, if possible." I went that afternoon. Raymond had done some preliminary searching in the time between my call and my arrival. What he had found was this. Philip's accounting firm had, over the previous 2 years, accumulated significant debt. 2 of his 3 original partners had left the firm, one to start his own practice, one under circumstances that Raymond described carefully as disputed. There had been a lawsuit from a former client, now settled but costly. The firm had taken on a line of credit at levels that Raymond, who had seen many small business failures in his career, described as troubling. None of this had been mentioned to me, not once. Raymond also told me something else. He had a contact at the law firm that had sent the letter, a colleague he'd worked with on a joint file years ago. He had made a quiet call. The inquiry, it turned out, had been initiated to assess the process for contesting a will specifically, to understand the legal grounds under which an executor's decision-making capacity might be challenged if an executor were found to be experiencing cognitive or physical decline. I sat across from Raymond's desk and let that settle into me. They were building a case. Not yet, maybe, but they were laying the groundwork. The liver enzyme, the questions about my health, the inquiry about contesting the will. My son was preparing for the possibility that I might not be mentally competent to manage my own estate, and that if he could establish that, or simply create enough legal uncertainty, there might be a path toward gaining control of assets that would solve his firm's problems. I drove back to the apartment in the dark. I sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. He was my son. I had coached his hockey team when he was 9. I had driven him to university orientation in the rain and helped him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs and bought him a coffee in the cafeteria and told him I was proud of him and meant every word of it. I had danced with his mother at his wedding. I had been in the waiting room when each of his boys was born and held them when they were still hours old and felt something so enormous it had no name. And now he was researching how to have my competence questioned, so he could reach into my accounts and my property and take what he needed to cover his failures. I went upstairs. I poured 2 fingers of rye, which I almost never do. I drank it slowly, and then I picked up the phone and called my daughter Claire in Calgary. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. There was a long silence on her end, and then she said, "Dad, I need to come to Winnipeg." I told her not yet. I told her I needed a few weeks to understand this properly before anything was said or done. I told her I loved her, and that she should trust me to handle it. She agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that I call Raymond again first thing in the morning, and that I kept her informed of every step. I agreed to both. Raymond and I spent the next 3 weeks in careful, methodical work. We conducted a thorough review of my will, updated several clauses, and executed a new power of attorney document naming Claire as my primary decision-maker in the event of incapacity, with Raymond as the secondary. We documented my current health status formally, with a written assessment from my family doctor, confirming that my cognitive and physical functioning were excellent, and that the liver enzyme anomaly was, as he had suspected, related to a natural supplement and had already normalized on a retest. We made sure that documentation was dated, signed, and filed appropriately. Raymond also advised me, with characteristic restraint, that I might want to be thoughtful about how I conducted myself with Philip in the coming weeks, that nothing should change on the surface, that the worst thing I could do was alert him that I knew what he was doing before everything was properly secured. So when Sandra called with the invitation to Christmas at the lake house, I said yes. I said it sounded wonderful. I asked if the boys were excited. I drove out to Lac du Bonnet the first week of December to open the house and get it ready. It was cold and clear, the lake frozen at the edges, but still dark water in the center. The Manitoba maple over Pepper's grave had dropped all its leaves and stood bare against the white sky. The house smelled of the particular cold emptiness that sets in when a building has been closed for months, wood and dust, and something faintly of the lake itself. I walked through every room. I checked the furnace and the plumbing and the smoke detectors. I stood in the bedroom that Marguerite and I had shared for 30 years of summers, and I looked at the view of the water through the window, and I let myself feel the grief for a moment. Clean and honest, before I put it aside and got to work. They arrived on the 23rd. Philip drove, with Sandra in the passenger seat, and the 3 boys Owen, 16, Marcus, 13, and little Theo, 8, piled into the back seat with their bags and their devices, and the particular restless energy of boys who have been in a vehicle for 2 hours. I stood on the porch and watched the truck come down the lane, and I smiled and I waved, and I felt the complicated weight of what I knew and what I could not yet say sitting in my chest like a stone. We had a good evening. That was the hardest thing, how good it was. Owen helped me carry wood in from the stack by the shed. Marcus wanted to hear about the engineering work I'd done on the city's flood control systems, which surprised me and moved me in ways I didn't expect. Theo fell asleep on the couch before 9, and Philip carried him to bed and came back down and poured himself a beer. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw in his face something that looked like the boy I had raised. Tired, a little lost, weighted down by something he didn't know how to talk about. I thought, if he had just come to me, if he had just sat across from me at this kitchen table and said, "Dad, I'm in trouble. I need your help," I would have helped him. I would have found a way. I was not a man who counted his money above his family, but he hadn't done that. He had gone to a law firm and started building a case. At dinner on Christmas Eve, Sandra had made tourtière, which she made every year, and there were mashed potatoes and roasted carrots and a salad that the boys largely ignored. The candles on the table were the tall white ones that Marguerite had always used. I had found them in the same drawer where she kept them. We ate and talked, and the boys argued about something inconsequential that made everyone laugh. And then Philip raised his glass. "To Dad," he said, "and to the lake house. May we have many more Christmases here." He said it evenly, warmly, even. Sandra raised her glass and smiled. The boys raised theirs, the older 2 with sparkling water, Theo with juice. "To family," I said. I looked at my son across the table. He held my gaze for a moment and then looked away, and I saw it again, that measuring quality, that small, careful calculation running behind the warmth. That night, after everyone was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and my phone, and I sent a brief message to Raymond. Everything on schedule. Proceeding tomorrow, as discussed. His reply came 3 minutes later. Confirmed. Claire lands at 9 a.m. Drive safe. Christmas morning. I was up before 5. I made coffee and sat with it in the dark kitchen, watching the first pale light come up over the frozen lake. The ice had pushed all the way across now, white and still in the early morning. There was a crow on the dock post, just sitting there, and I watched it for a long time. Claire arrived at 9:30. She had flown from Calgary to Winnipeg the evening before and stayed at a hotel, and now she was here, pulling her car down the lane, and when she got out and I walked to meet her, she put her arms around me and held on for a long time without saying anything. Philip came out of the house a few minutes later. He stopped on the porch when he saw Claire's car, and I watched something move across his face, surprise, and then something more complicated. "Claire," he said, "you didn't say you were coming." "Last-minute decision," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "I didn't want Dad to be the only one without family this Christmas." We went inside. We opened gifts with the boys, and it was real enough. Theo's delight at his presence was absolutely genuine, and watching it was still a pure thing, untouched by any of the rest of it. We had breakfast. Sandra was quiet, more than usual. Philip watched me with a care he was trying not to show. After breakfast, I asked Philip to come out to the shed with me. I said I needed help with something. He put on his coat and followed me across the yard, and we stood in the cold shed with the smell of old motor oil and firewood around us, and I turned to face him. I told him what I knew. Not in anger. I had decided weeks ago that I would not do it in anger. I told him about the letter from Deborah Haynes. I told him about my conversation with Raymond. I told him what Raymond had discovered about the firm's finances and the nature of the legal inquiry. He went still. He didn't try to deny it, which told me something he was smart enough to know there was no point. He looked at the floor of the shed, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The firm is in trouble, Dad. I didn't know how to tell you." I said, "That's not what you decided to do about it." He looked up at me. His eyes were wet, and I don't know, even now, how much of it was genuine. "I wasn't going to go through with it," he said. I was looking at options. I was desperate. I wasn't actually going to. "Philip." I kept my voice level. "You retained a law firm to research contesting my will on grounds of incapacity. You asked me about my health specifically to gather information. That's not looking at options. That's a plan." He didn't have an answer for that. I told him what I had done. The updated will, the power of attorney naming Claire, the physician's documentation. I told him that Raymond had copies of everything and that the law firm he had retained had been formally notified that I was fully competent and legally represented and that any further inquiry would be treated as harassment. I told him that the lake house was not going to solve his firm's problems, and that even if it had, he would never have had access to it through the path he was exploring, because I had closed that path completely. He sat down on an old wooden stool in the corner of the shed. He put his face in his hands. He was crying, I think, or close to it. I stood across from him, and I thought about his mother, and about the morning he was born, and about 100 ordinary moments that add up to the whole weight of a life shared with a child. I thought about how much I would have given to still have Marguerite here, sitting next to me in that shed, because she was always better than I was at knowing what to say. I said, "I love you. I will always love you. But what you were considering would have harmed me, and it would have destroyed what is left of this family, and I will not pretend it didn't happen." I told him that if he wanted help with the firm, real help, honest and direct, a conversation about what he could do, and what I was willing to consider that conversation, was available to him. But it would happen on different terms. Clean terms. No lawyers researching my cognitive decline. No letters to law firms I'd never heard of. A son asking his father for help, plainly and directly, the way it should have been from the beginning. He nodded. He didn't say anything for a long time. We went back inside separately. Claire met my eyes when I came through the door, and I gave her a small nod, and she looked down at her coffee and released a breath. The rest of Christmas Day was strange and quiet in the way that days are when something true has been said out loud and cannot be unsaid. The boys played outside on the ice near the shore, and Sandra was subdued in a way that made me think she had known more than she had let on, though I didn't pursue that. We had dinner. We cleaned up together. The candles burned down. In the evening, Claire and I sat on the porch in our coats with mugs of tea, watching the last light fade over the lake. The crow was gone. The ice was blue-gray in the dusk. She said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I thought about it honestly. "I think so," I said. "I will be." "What are you going to do?" "About him. About the firm." "I don't know yet," I said. "I need to think about what I can do and what I should do. They're not always the same thing." She put her hand over mine and we sat there for a while without speaking, the way you can with people you have known your whole life. Philip and Sandra left on the 26th with the boys. The goodbye was awkward and real, and there was nothing tidy about it. He hugged me at the car, and I hugged him back, and we held on for a moment longer than usual, and I don't know what it meant entirely, but it was not nothing. Claire stayed an extra night. We talked until late, about her mother and about the years ahead, and about the lake house and what we wanted to do with it someday. She told me she was grateful I had handled it the way I had, not with lawyers and restraining orders and public confrontation, but directly, between us, within the family. I told her I wasn't sure it was the right choice, that I still wasn't sure, but it was the one I had made. She flew back to Calgary the next morning. I drove her to the Winnipeg airport and we said goodbye at the departures door, and she turned back once and waved, and I stood there until I couldn't see her anymore. 3 months later, Philip came to see me at the apartment. He came alone, without Sandra, And he sat across the kitchen table, and he told me the full truth about the firm for the first time. How much the debt was, how it had accumulated, the decisions he wasn't proud of. He was honest in a way he hadn't been in years, maybe ever, and I listened without interrupting. I told him I would not give him money to cover what had already been lost. That was gone, and no amount of my savings would change that. But I told him I would pay for a consultation with a financial restructuring firm I knew through old professional contacts, and that I would co-sign a personal reference letter for him if he pursued new employment while winding down the practice. It wasn't rescue. It was a handhold. The climb out was going to be his. He accepted it. He said thank you, and he meant it. And the quality of that thank you was different from anything I had heard from him in a long time, without the brightness of someone who wants something, without calculation. Just his voice, tired and grateful, and I could hear in it something I recognized. The boy he had been, and the man he was still trying to figure out how to be. I still live at the lake house. I spend my winters in Winnipeg and my summers on the water, the way Marguerite and I always planned. The Manitoba maple is still there. The dock is holding. The loons came back in May, same as every year. I think about the Christmas that just passed often, but not with bitterness. I think about the choices that were made, the ones I made, the ones Philip made, the ones neither of us would ever fully undo. I think about how easy it is, when you are in financial trouble, to begin to see the people around you as resources rather than as people. How that happens gradually, in small rationalizations, until the distance between a person and what they are doing feels smaller than it actually is. I think about how the opposite is also true, how easy it is, when you have been hurt, to respond with a scorched earth completeness that leaves nothing standing, to use the legal tools available to you as weapons rather than protections. I had those tools. I had every right to use them that way. I chose not to. I am not certain I was right to do so, but I am certain it was a choice, and that the choice mattered, and that it came from somewhere other than pride or anger or the desire to win. If you are reading this as a parent, or if you are the adult child of an aging parent, I want to say one thing plainly, because I think it needs to be said. The assets your parent has accumulated are not an advance on your inheritance. They are the result of a life of work and sacrifice and planning that was done, most of the time, long before you were old enough to understand what it cost. They belong to that person until that person is gone, and what happens to them after that is a gift, not an entitlement. If your family is struggling, ask for help. Say the real words. Sit at the table and tell the truth. That conversation is hard and humbling, and it is the only one that keeps a family intact. The other path, the quiet research, the measured calculations, the groundwork laid while someone sleeps in the next room, that path does not end where you think it will. And once you have walked it, even a little, something changes that does not easily change back. I know this because I watched it happen in my son's eyes, and I know it because I watched it change, slowly, when the truth came out, and the measuring stopped, and there was nothing left between us but what was real. That is enough. It has to be.